In the 3rd century before the Common Era, the city of Alexandria stood at the western edge of the Nile Delta, where the river's many tributaries emptied into the warm waters of the Mediterranean Sea. The city had been founded some decades earlier by Alexander of Macedon, who had chosen the site for its natural harbor and its proximity to the ancient Egyptian settlement of Rhakotis. By the time the Ptolemaic dynasty had firmly established itself as the ruling power of Egypt, Alexandria had grown into one of the largest and most densely populated cities in the known world. Its harbor received merchant vessels from across the Mediterranean basin carrying grain, papyrus, linen, and glass, and returning with timber, metals, and goods from as far away as the western shores of Iberia and the trading posts along the coast of the Indian Ocean. The city was divided into several quarters, each inhabited by distinct communities: Greek settlers, native Egyptians, Jewish residents, and smaller populations of Syrians, Persians, and peoples from the further reaches of the Hellenistic world. These communities maintained their own customs, their own languages, and their own systems of worship, though they lived and traded alongside one another in a proximity that no other city of the ancient world could quite replicate. The Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, descended from one of Alexander's generals, governed through a system that borrowed heavily from both Greek administrative models and the older pharaonic traditions of the Nile Valley. They adopted the titles and ceremonial dress of the Egyptian pharaohs, presented themselves in temple reliefs according to Egyptian artistic conventions, and participated in the religious festivals that had been observed along the Nile for thousands of years. At the same time, they administered their kingdom through Greek-speaking bureaucrats, maintained a court that followed Hellenistic customs, and patronized Greek learning, literature, and philosophy with considerable generosity. This dual character of the Ptolemaic state, Egyptian in its religious legitimacy, Greek in its administrative and intellectual culture, produced a society in which ideas, symbols, and religious practices from both traditions circulated with unusual freedom. The great library and the adjacent research institution, known as the Mouseion, attracted scholars from across the Greek-speaking world who came to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, and natural philosophy in an environment supported by royal patronage and access to an unprecedented collection of texts. Within the temples of the Egyptian gods, meanwhile, a priestly class continued to maintain the rituals, hymns, and sacred writings that had been passed down through countless generations, preserving a body of religious knowledge that the Greeks regarded with a mixture of curiosity and deep respect. It was within this particular environment, a city where Greek philosophy and Egyptian priestly wisdom coexisted, where the boundaries between one tradition and another were more permeable than they had ever been before, that a process of cultural and religious synthesis began to take place. The Greeks who settled in Egypt encountered a civilization far older than their own, one whose temples, monuments, and written records stretched back into an antiquity so remote that even the most learned Greek historians could not fully reckon with it. The Egyptians, for their part, encountered in the Greeks a philosophical tradition that sought to understand the nature of the cosmos through reason, argument, and systematic inquiry. Neither tradition was absorbed entirely into the other. Instead, what emerged over the course of several centuries was a series of new intellectual and religious forms that drew upon both traditions without belonging fully to either one. New cults arose that combined Greek and Egyptian elements. Philosophical schools developed that sought to reconcile the teachings of Plato and Aristotle with the sacred knowledge preserved in the Egyptian temples. And a body of sacred literature began to appear, written in Greek but claiming an Egyptian origin, that would come to be associated with a single enigmatic name, a name that belonged to no historical individual, but rather to a figure who existed at the point where two ancient civilizations met and merged. The Egyptian god Thoth had been worshipped along the Nile for as long as recorded Egyptian history could attest. He was associated with writing, with the measurement of time, with the keeping of records, and with the sacred knowledge that sustained the order of the cosmos. In the earliest periods of Egyptian civilization, Thoth appeared in the form of an ibis, or as a man with the head of an ibis, and he was credited with the invention of hieroglyphic writing, the establishment of the calendar, and the creation of the arts and sciences that allowed human society to function. He served as the scribe of the gods, recording the judgments made in the hall of the dead, where the hearts of the deceased were weighed against the feather of truth. He was also associated with the moon, with magic, and with the secret knowledge that the gods had entrusted to the priestly class for safekeeping. In the theological systems of the major Egyptian temples, Thoth occupied a position of considerable importance, and the city of Hermopolis, in Upper Egypt, served as the principal center of his cult. The priests of Thoth maintained extensive libraries of sacred texts, and they were regarded throughout Egypt as the custodians of a particularly ancient and authoritative form of religious wisdom. The Greek god Hermes, meanwhile, occupied a somewhat different position within the Greek religious imagination. He was the messenger of the gods, the guide of souls to the underworld, the patron of travelers, merchants, and thieves, and the inventor of the lyre and of various other useful arts. He was associated with boundaries, transitions, and the crossing of thresholds, between the world of the living and the world of the dead, between one city and another, between the familiar and the unknown. In the philosophical traditions that developed in the Greek world from the 5th century onward, Hermes also came to be associated with speech, interpretation, and the transmission of hidden knowledge. The Greeks who encountered the Egyptian god Thoth recognized in him certain qualities that reminded them of their own Hermes: the association with writing, with sacred knowledge, with the communication between the divine and the human. And they began, quite naturally, to identify the two gods with one another. This process of identification, known to modern scholars as interpretatio Graeca, was common throughout the Hellenistic world, where Greeks routinely equated the gods of other cultures with their own deities on the basis of perceived similarities in function or character. The identification of Thoth with Hermes was not a casual or superficial association. It was taken seriously by both Greek and Egyptian intellectuals, and it produced, over time, a composite figure who was understood to possess the qualities of both gods: the scribal wisdom and cosmic authority of Thoth, combined with the eloquence, ingenuity, and mediating role of Hermes. This composite figure came to be known by a distinctive epithet, Trismegistus, a Greek word meaning thrice greatest. The title itself appears to have been derived from Egyptian honorific formulae used to address Thoth in temple inscriptions, where the god was sometimes described with repeated superlatives indicating his supreme greatness. In its Greek form, the epithet Trismegistus conveyed the idea of a being who had attained the highest possible degree of wisdom, authority, and sacred knowledge. A figure who stood above all other sages and priests as the ultimate source of divine revelation. It was in this atmosphere of spiritual searching and intellectual competition that the texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus began to circulate. These writings did not constitute a single unified work, nor were they produced by a single author at a single moment in time. They were, rather, a diverse collection of treatises, dialogues, prayers, and instructional texts, composed over a period of several centuries by unknown writers who chose to attribute their works to the ancient sage Hermes. The practice of pseudepigraphical attribution, that is, the writing of texts under the name of a revered figure from the past, was extremely common in the ancient world and carried no stigma of dishonesty. It was understood as a way of placing one's work within a recognized tradition, of claiming the authority of a master whose name guaranteed the truth and importance of what was being said. The writers of the Hermetic texts were not attempting to deceive their readers. They were participating in a literary and religious convention that was deeply embedded in the cultures from which they came. The community or communities that produced the Hermetic writings are difficult to identify with any precision. No ancient source describes a formal Hermetic school or institution, and no archaeological evidence has been found that can be definitively linked to an organized Hermetic community. It is likely that the texts were produced by small, informal groups of intellectuals, perhaps in Alexandria, perhaps in other Egyptian cities, who gathered to study and discuss philosophical and religious questions within a framework that combined elements of Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, Jewish thought, and other traditions current in the Eastern Mediterranean. These groups may have included both Greeks and Egyptians, and they may have had connections to the priestly establishments of the Egyptian temples, where the cult of Thoth was still maintained and where the tradition of sacred learning had been preserved for millennia. What is clear is that the Hermetic writers were deeply engaged with the philosophical currents of their time, particularly with the Platonic tradition, and that they sought to express their understanding of the divine, the cosmos, and the human soul in a language that was at once philosophical and devotional, rational and mystical. The most important collection of Hermetic texts to survive from antiquity is the body of writings known as the Corpus Hermeticum, a group of 17 Greek treatises that were probably compiled into their present form sometime in the late ancient period, though the individual treatises themselves may date from as early as the 1st century of the Common Era to as late as the 3rd or 4th century. These treatises take the form of dialogues, in which Hermes Trismegistus instructs a student or group of students in the fundamental truths about the nature of God, the creation of the world, the structure of the cosmos, and the destiny of the human soul. The tone of these dialogues is calm, measured, and authoritative, and the language in which they are written combines the precision of Greek philosophical discourse with a devotional warmth that is more characteristic of religious scripture than of academic philosophy. The student in these dialogues is most often identified as Asclepius, who in the Hermetic tradition is not the Greek god of medicine, but rather a disciple of Hermes, or as Tat, who is identified as the son of Hermes and who represents the next generation of initiates into the sacred wisdom. In some treatises, Hermes himself receives instruction from a higher divine intelligence referred to as nous or as Poimandres, a name that may derive from an Egyptian phrase meaning knowledge of the sun god. The first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, known as the Poimandres, describes a visionary experience in which a divine being appears to the narrator and reveals to him the origins of the cosmos and of humanity. The account that follows bears certain resemblances to the creation narrative found in the opening chapters of the book of Genesis, but it is framed within a philosophical vocabulary that owes much to Platonic thought. The divine mind, or nous, is described as the first principle from which all things proceed. From nous there emanates a second principle, the logos, or divine word, which brings order to the formless matter of the cosmos and sets in motion the processes by which the heavenly bodies, the elements, and the living creatures of the earth come into being. The human being is described as a special creation, fashioned in the image of the divine mind, and endowed with the capacity to ascend, through knowledge and devotion, to a reunion with the source from which all things have come. This vision of the cosmos as a divine emanation and of the human soul as a spark of the divine mind temporarily dwelling in a material body, would become one of the central themes of the Hermetic tradition, repeated and elaborated in treatise after treatise across the entire body of Hermetic literature. The teaching method attributed to Hermes Trismegistus in these texts followed a pattern that was characteristic of much ancient philosophical and religious instruction. The master spoke, and the student listened. Questions were posed, but they were posed by the student as prompts for further instruction, not as challenges or objections. The relationship between teacher and student was understood as a sacred one, modeled on the relationship between the divine and the human, and the process of learning was understood not merely as the acquisition of information, but as a form of spiritual transformation. The student who received the teachings of Hermes was expected to undergo a change in his very nature, to move from a state of ignorance and attachment to the material world to a state of knowledge and communion with the divine. This process was sometimes described in terms borrowed from the mystery religions as a kind of initiation or rebirth, and the Hermetic writings frequently use the language of darkness and light, sleep and waking, death and resurrection to describe the transformation that knowledge of the divine was supposed to bring about. The fourth treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, known by its Greek title as the Crater or the Mixing Bowl, describes this process in particularly vivid terms. In this treatise, Hermes explains that God has placed a great mixing bowl filled with the divine mind in the world and has sent a herald to proclaim to all human souls that they may, if they choose, immerse themselves in this bowl and thereby receive the gift of intellect and spiritual understanding. Those who heed the call and immerse themselves are transformed. They become, in effect, different beings, capable of perceiving the divine truths that are hidden from ordinary mortals. Those who do not heed the call remain in their state of ignorance, governed by the appetites of the body and the illusions of the senses, and they pass through life without ever attaining the knowledge for which the human soul was created. This teaching about the transformative power of divine knowledge was central to the Hermetic tradition, and it informed every aspect of the Hermetic path. The relationship between teacher and student, the methods of instruction, the goals of contemplation and prayer, and the ethical demands that were placed upon the practitioner. The Hermetic writings consistently taught that the acquisition of sacred knowledge was not merely an intellectual achievement, but a moral and spiritual one, requiring the practitioner to cultivate certain virtues: temperance, self-control, detachment from worldly pleasures, reverence for the divine, and to purge from his soul certain vices: greed, anger, lust, vanity, and the desire for power over others. The 13th treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, which describes a process of spiritual rebirth in which the 10 vices or tormentors that afflict the human soul are expelled one by one and replaced by the 10 divine powers, provides the most detailed account of this process of moral and spiritual purification, and it reveals the essentially soteriological character of the Hermetic tradition. Its concern, that is, not merely with the acquisition of knowledge for its own sake, but with the salvation and transformation of the human soul. The cosmological framework within which the Hermetic teachings were set out was elaborate and detailed. The Hermetic writers described a cosmos that was organized in a series of concentric spheres, with the Earth at the center, surrounded by the spheres of the 7 planets: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and beyond them the sphere of the fixed stars, and beyond that the realm of the divine mind itself. Each of the planetary spheres was associated with certain qualities and powers, and the soul, in its descent from the divine into the material world, was understood to acquire the characteristics associated with each sphere as it passed through them. In its ascent back to the divine, the soul shed these acquired characteristics one by one, divesting itself at each stage of the passions, appetites, and illusions that had accumulated during its sojourn in the material world, until it arrived at last at the eighth sphere, the sphere of the fixed stars, where it recovered its original divine nature and was reunited with the source from which it had come. This scheme of cosmic descent and ascent was not unique to the Hermetic tradition. It had parallels in Gnostic cosmology, in Neoplatonic philosophy, and in certain strands of Jewish and Christian mysticism. But the Hermetic writers presented it with a distinctive clarity and concreteness that gave it a powerful appeal for readers. Across many centuries and many different cultural traditions, the daily practices of those who studied and transmitted the Hermetic teachings are not described in detail in the surviving texts, but certain inferences can be drawn from the writings themselves and from what is known about similar groups in the ancient world. It is likely that the Hermetic communities gathered at regular intervals to read and discuss the sacred texts, to engage in prayer and meditation, and perhaps to perform simple rituals of purification and consecration. The texts themselves frequently describe the proper attitude with which the student should approach the teachings, with reverence, with silence, with a mind free from the distractions of worldly concern. And these descriptions may reflect the actual practices of the communities that produced and used the texts. The emphasis on silence, contemplation, and the gradual acquisition of wisdom through sustained study suggests a community that valued patience, discipline, and the slow cultivation of spiritual understanding over dramatic displays of religious enthusiasm. The tools of the Hermetic student were, in the first instance, the texts themselves. The Hermetic writings were copied, recopied, and transmitted by hand on papyrus scrolls and later on parchment codices, and the preservation and accurate transmission of these texts was a task that required considerable skill and care. The scribal traditions of Egypt, which were among the oldest and most sophisticated in the ancient world, provided a natural context for this work, and it is possible that some of the individuals involved in the production of the Hermetic texts were trained in the scribal arts of the Egyptian temples. In addition to the texts, the Hermetic student would have been expected to develop certain habits of mind, the capacity for sustained contemplation, the ability to hold complex philosophical ideas in the memory and to reflect upon them over time, and a willingness to subordinate personal desire and worldly ambition to the pursuit of spiritual knowledge. The Hermetic writings consistently emphasize the importance of self-discipline, of withdrawal from the distractions of ordinary life, and of the cultivation of an inner stillness that would allow the student to perceive the divine truths that lay hidden beneath the surface of the material world. The methods by which these teachings were transmitted appear to have been primarily oral and textual. The dialogues of the Corpus Hermeticum preserve a literary form that was probably modeled on the actual practices of the Hermetic communities, a form in which a teacher would expound upon a particular topic while a student or group of students listened, asked questions, and received further elaboration. This method of instruction, which has parallels in the Platonic dialogues, in the teaching practices of the Stoic and Epicurean schools, and in the catechetical traditions of early Christianity, was well suited to the gradual and progressive nature of the Hermetic path. The student was not expected to understand everything at once. The teachings were revealed in stages, with each stage building upon the last, and the process of learning was understood to be a lifelong endeavor that would continue to deepen and mature as the student's capacity for understanding grew. The Emerald Tablet, perhaps the most famous single text associated with Hermes Trismegistus, is a brief and cryptic document that summarizes, in highly compressed and symbolic language, the fundamental principles of Hermetic philosophy. its most celebrated passage. That which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is like that which is above, to accomplish the miracles of the one thing, became one of the most frequently quoted phrases in the entire history of Western esotericism. The origins of the Emerald Tablet are obscure. It does not appear in any of the Greek Hermetic texts that survive from antiquity, and the earliest known version of it appears in an Arabic text dating from the 8th or 9th century of the Common Era. It is possible that the Emerald Tablet derives from a Greek or Egyptian original that has been lost, or it may have been composed in the Arabic-speaking world by writers working within the Hermetic tradition as it had been transmitted to them through translations and compilations. In either case, the Emerald Tablet came to occupy a position of enormous importance in the alchemical and esoteric traditions of both the Islamic world and medieval and Renaissance Europe, and its influence on the development of Western thought extends far beyond the boundaries of what is usually considered philosophy or theology. The reputation of Hermes Trismegistus grew steadily throughout the centuries of the Roman Empire, and by the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, his name was known and invoked by writers and thinkers across the entire Mediterranean world. This was not a sudden or dramatic rise to prominence. It was, rather, a gradual accumulation of references, citations, and endorsements that, taken together, established Hermes Trismegistus as one of the most authoritative names in the ancient world's vast and crowded landscape of sages, prophets, and revealers of divine truth. The process by which this occurred was complex and involved the participation of individuals and communities from a wide range of philosophical, religious, and cultural backgrounds, many of whom had little or no direct contact with one another. What they shared was a common recognition that the writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus contained something of genuine importance, a body of teachings that spoke to the deepest questions of human existence and that carried with them the authority of an antiquity so remote as to be almost beyond reckoning. Among the earliest and most significant attestations of the authority of Hermes Trismegistus in the Greek-speaking world are the references found in the writings of the Church Fathers, the Christian theologians of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, who undertook the task of defining and defending the doctrines of the emerging Christian Church. These writers were deeply engaged with the philosophical and religious traditions of the Greco-Roman world, and they frequently cited the writings of pagan philosophers and sages in the course of their theological arguments. Several of them, including Lactantius, Clement of Alexandria, and Augustine of Hippo, made reference to Hermes Trismegistus and to the writings attributed to him, sometimes with approval and sometimes with reservations, but almost always with a recognition of the great antiquity and the considerable philosophical importance of the Hermetic texts. Lactantius, writing in the early 4th century, quoted extensively from the Hermetic writings and presented Hermes Trismegistus as a pagan prophet who had, in some respects, anticipated the truths of Christianity. Clement of Alexandria, writing somewhat earlier, included Hermes among the great sages of the ancient world and credited him with the authorship of a vast library of sacred books, 42 volumes according to Clement's account, that covered every branch of knowledge from theology and philosophy to astronomy, medicine, and the rituals of the Egyptian temples. These claims, transmitted through the writings of the Church Fathers, would play an important role in establishing the reputation of Hermes Trismegistus in later centuries, particularly during the Renaissance, when Christian scholars rediscovered the Hermetic texts and read them in the light of the patristic tradition. The authority of Hermes Trismegistus was also acknowledged by writers working within the pagan philosophical tradition. The Neoplatonist philosopher Iamblichus, writing in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, devoted considerable attention to the Hermetic writings in his treatise on the mysteries of the Egyptians, a work that sought to defend the traditional religious practices of Egypt and the wider Greco-Roman world against the criticisms of the skeptically inclined philosopher Porphyry. Iamblichus presented the Hermetic texts as genuine expressions of ancient Egyptian wisdom, and he argued that the religious and theurgical practices described in these texts were rooted in a deep understanding of the cosmic order that the Greek philosophical tradition alone could not fully grasp. For Iamblichus, the authority of Hermes Trismegistus was not merely historical or literary. It was spiritual and metaphysical, grounded in a direct connection to the divine that the Egyptian priestly tradition had preserved more faithfully than any other. This endorsement by one of the most influential Neoplatonist philosophers of late antiquity helped to secure the position of the Hermetic writings within the broader tradition of Platonic philosophy, a tradition that would continue to shape Western intellectual life for more than 1,000 years. The influence of the Hermetic writings extended beyond the boundaries of formal philosophy and theology, and into the domain of what the ancient world called the practical arts: astrology, alchemy, medicine, and the various forms of divination and magical practice that were widely pursued throughout the Roman Empire. The technical Hermetica, as modern scholars have termed this body of texts, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus a vast and comprehensive knowledge of the natural world, including the properties of plants, minerals, and celestial bodies, the relationships between the macrocosm and the microcosm, and the techniques by which these relationships could be manipulated for practical purposes. Alchemical texts attributed to Hermes described processes of transformation and purification that were understood both as practical operations upon physical substances and as allegories for the spiritual transformation of the practitioner. Astrological texts attributed to Hermes set forth systems for interpreting the movements of the planets and their influence upon human affairs. Medical texts attributed to Hermes prescribed treatments and remedies based on the correspondences between the parts of the human body and the celestial spheres. These practical texts were enormously popular throughout the ancient world, and they established Hermes Trismegistus as an authority not only in matters of philosophical and religious speculation, but also in the applied sciences and arts that governed much of the daily life of the ancient Mediterranean. The institutional context within which the Hermetic writings circulated and the reputation of Hermes Trismegistus grew is not easy to reconstruct with precision. Unlike the major philosophical schools of the ancient world, the Platonic Academy, the Aristotelian Lyceum, the Stoic and Epicurean schools, the Hermetic tradition does not appear to have been organized around a single institutional center or a recognized line of succession from master to student. There was no Hermetic school in the formal sense, no building or campus where Hermetic teachings were publicly offered, and no official curriculum or program of study. Instead, the Hermetic tradition appears to have been transmitted through a diffuse network of small communities, individual teachers, and private collections of texts, held together not by institutional structures, but by a shared reverence for the figure of Hermes Trismegistus and a shared commitment to the body of teachings attributed to him. This decentralized character of the Hermetic tradition may have contributed to its resilience, since it was not dependent on the survival of any single institution or community. When one group of Hermetic practitioners disappeared or was dispersed, the texts themselves could survive and find new readers in other places and other times. The geographical range of the Hermetic tradition was considerable. While Egypt, and particularly Alexandria, appears to have been the primary center of Hermetic literary production, references to the Hermetic writings and to the figure of Hermes Trismegistus can be found in texts originating from a wide range of locations across the Roman Empire and beyond. In the eastern provinces of the empire, Hermetic ideas circulated alongside Gnostic, Neoplatonic, and early Christian teachings, and the boundaries between these traditions were often fluid and indistinct. In the western provinces, the Latin translation of the Asclepius ensured that at least some elements of the Hermetic tradition were accessible to readers who did not know Greek. In the Syriac-speaking world, Hermetic texts were translated and studied alongside other works of Greek philosophy and science. And in the Arabic-speaking world, which would emerge as a major center of intellectual activity in the centuries following the rise of Islam, the Hermetic tradition would find a new and enormously productive reception as Arabic scholars translated, commented upon, and expanded the body of Hermetic writings in ways that would profoundly influence the development of alchemy, astrology, and philosophy in the Islamic world, and, through it, in medieval and Renaissance Europe. The social status of the figure of Hermes Trismegistus within the ancient world was unique. He was not a god in the usual sense, nor was he a philosopher or a sage in the manner of Plato or Pythagoras. He occupied a category of his own, a figure who was understood to be more than human, but less than fully divine, a mediator between the divine and the human who had been granted a special dispensation to reveal the truths of the cosmos to those who were capable of receiving them. In some texts, he was described as a man who had lived in the earliest ages of the world and who had attained, through his extraordinary wisdom and piety, a degree of knowledge that was normally reserved for the gods alone. In other texts, he was described as a divine being who had descended into the human world in order to communicate the teachings of the divine mind to those who were ready to receive them. In still other texts, he was described simply as a name, a personification of the tradition of sacred learning that had been preserved in the Egyptian temples since the beginning of time. These different conceptions of Hermes Trismegistus were not regarded as contradictory by the ancient writers who invoked his authority. They were understood, rather, as different aspects of a single, multifaceted figure whose true nature was ultimately beyond the capacity of human language to express. The reception of the Hermetic writings by the educated classes of the Roman Empire was generally favorable, though it varied according to the philosophical and religious commitments of the individual reader. For Platonists and Neoplatonists, the Hermetic texts represented a valuable confirmation of the basic insights of the Platonic tradition, the primacy of the intelligible world over the sensible world, the divine origin of the human soul, the possibility of ascending from the material to the spiritual through the exercise of reason and contemplation, expressed in a language that carried the additional authority of Egyptian antiquity. For Stoics, and those influenced by Stoic thought, the Hermetic emphasis on the unity and interconnectedness of all things within the cosmic order resonated with their own understanding of the Logos as the rational principle that pervaded and governed the entire universe. For followers of the various mystery religions, the Hermetic texts offered a philosophical framework within which the ritual practices of initiation, purification, and spiritual rebirth could be understood and justified. And for those who pursued the practical arts of astrology, alchemy, and medicine, the technical Hermetica provided a body of knowledge and technique that was sanctioned by the highest possible authority and that promised practical results in the material world as well as spiritual advancement. The period of greatest prominence for the Hermetic tradition in the ancient world appears to have been the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries of the Common Era, a period that coincided, not coincidentally, with the general flourishing of religious and philosophical pluralism throughout the Roman Empire. During these centuries, the traditional religious institutions of the Greco-Roman world coexisted, sometimes peacefully and sometimes in tension, with a wide variety of newer religious and philosophical movements, including Christianity, Gnosticism, Manichaeism, Neoplatonism, and the various mystery cults. The Hermetic tradition occupied a distinctive position within this crowded landscape, offering a form of spiritual and philosophical teaching that was compatible with many of these other traditions without being identical to any of them. A Hermetic practitioner could read the Corpus Hermeticum alongside the dialogues of Plato, the hymns of the Egyptian temples, and the scriptures of the Gnostic communities, and find in all of them a common thread of truth that pointed toward the same ultimate reality. This ecumenical quality of the Hermetic tradition, its capacity to accommodate and integrate insights from a wide range of philosophical and religious sources, was one of its greatest strengths, and it helps to explain the remarkable durability and adaptability of the Hermetic writings across many centuries and many different cultural contexts. The relationship between the Hermetic tradition and the emerging Christian Church was complicated, and it cannot be reduced to a simple narrative of persecution and suppression. The Church Fathers, who had quoted the Hermetic writings with approval, Lactantius, Clement of Alexandria, and others, had done so because they recognized in those writings certain ideas and formulations that seemed to be compatible with, or even anticipatory of, Christian doctrine. The Hermetic teaching that the cosmos had been created by a single, supreme divine mind, that the human being was made in the image of that divine mind, and that the destiny of the soul was to return to its divine source through knowledge and spiritual purification. These ideas bore a striking resemblance to certain central tenets of Christian theology, and they could be read as evidence that the pagan sages of Egypt had been granted a partial revelation of the truths that would later be fully revealed in the Gospel. This sympathetic reading of the Hermetic texts by early Christian writers provided a degree of protection for the Hermetic tradition within the Christian cultural sphere, and it ensured that at least some elements of the Hermetic corpus would continue to be read and transmitted even after the suppression of the pagan religious institutions with which the tradition had been associated. At the same time, other elements of the Hermetic tradition were deeply problematic from a Christian point of view. The Asclepius, with its description of the animation of statues through the invocation of divine or demonic powers, was condemned by Augustine of Hippo as a dangerous and blasphemous text that revealed the true nature of Egyptian religion as a form of idolatry and demon worship. Augustine's condemnation carried enormous weight in the Latin-speaking Christian world, and it ensured that the Hermetic tradition would always be regarded with a degree of suspicion and ambivalence by Christian theologians, even those who were otherwise favorably disposed toward the philosophical content of the Hermetic writings. The tension between the philosophical appeal of the Hermetic texts and the theological dangers perceived in their more explicitly religious and magical content would remain a defining feature of the reception of the Hermetic tradition throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The Egyptian temples, which had served as the repositories of the priestly wisdom from which the Hermetic tradition drew much of its content and its authority, were among the last pagan institutions to be closed in the Roman Empire. The Temple of Isis at Philae, on the southern border of Egypt, continued to function as a center of worship until the 6th century, long after the temples of Greece and Rome had been shut down or converted to Christian use. The persistence of the Egyptian temple traditions in the face of Christian pressure testifies to the deep roots that these traditions had in the life and culture of the Nile Valley, and it suggests that the transmission of sacred knowledge, including the Hermetic writings, may have continued within the temple establishments for longer than is sometimes assumed. When the last Egyptian temples were finally closed, however, the institutional infrastructure that had supported the production and transmission of the Hermetic texts for centuries was effectively destroyed. and the future of the Hermetic tradition depended entirely on the survival of the texts themselves and on their capacity to find new readers in new cultural contexts. The survival of the Hermetic writings through the period of late antiquity and into the medieval period was, by any measure, a remarkable achievement. The vast majority of the literature produced in the ancient world has been lost, and the Hermetic texts might easily have shared the fate of so many other works of ancient philosophy, science, and religion that are known to us only through fragments, quotations, and passing references in the writings of later authors. That the Corpus Hermeticum survived at all is due in part to the continued interest of Byzantine scholars who preserved copies of the Greek text in the libraries and scriptoria of Constantinople and other centers of Greek-speaking Christian culture. The philosophical content of the Hermetic writings, their engagement with Platonic thought, their discussion of the nature of God, the cosmos, and the soul, was of sufficient interest to Byzantine readers to justify the labor of copying and preserving the texts, even though the pagan religious context in which those texts had originally been produced had long since ceased to exist. In the Latin-speaking West, the situation was different. The only Hermetic text that was widely available in Latin was the Asclepius, which had been translated from the Greek at some point in late antiquity and which circulated, despite Augustine's condemnation, in a number of manuscript copies throughout the medieval period. The other treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum were not known to Western European readers until the 15th century, and their rediscovery would constitute one of the most significant intellectual events of the early Renaissance. In the meantime, the Latin West knew Hermes Trismegistus primarily through the quotations and references found in the writings of the Church Fathers, particularly Lactantius and Augustine, and through the technical Hermetic traditions of astrology, alchemy, and natural magic, which had been transmitted to Western Europe through Arabic intermediaries during the 12th and 13th centuries. The relationship between the Hermetic tradition and the broader intellectual culture of the Islamic world was complex and multifaceted. Arabic scholars engaged with the Hermetic writings not as curiosities or relics of a bygone age, but as living texts that contained genuine insights into the nature of the cosmos and the means by which human beings could understand and participate in the processes of creation and transformation. The concept of the philosopher's stone, which would become so central to the European alchemical tradition, was developed in large measure by Arabic alchemists working within the Hermetic framework and the elaborate systems of correspondences between planets, metals, colors, and parts of the body that characterized the mature alchemical tradition were products of this same period of creative engagement with the Hermetic corpus. The Arabic Hermetic tradition also produced a number of important new texts that were attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, including works on talismanic magic, on the properties of stones and plants, and on the occult virtues of the natural world, and these texts would later be translated into Latin and incorporated into the Hermetic tradition as it was known in medieval and Renaissance Europe. The transmission of the Hermetic tradition from the Arabic-speaking world to Latin-speaking Western Europe occurred primarily during the 12th and 13th centuries as part of the broader movement of translation and intellectual exchange that is sometimes referred to as the 12th century Renaissance. In cities such as Toledo, Palermo, and others, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in close proximity and where multilingual scholars could serve as intermediaries between different linguistic and cultural traditions, Arabic texts on a wide range of subjects, including philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, alchemy, and astrology, were translated into Latin and made available to the scholars of Western Europe. Among the texts translated during this period were a number of Hermetic works, including alchemical treatises, astrological manuals, and the short but immensely influential text known as the Tabula Smaragdina, or Emerald Tablet. These translations introduced Western European readers to the name and the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, and they laid the groundwork for the much more dramatic encounter with the Hermetic tradition that would take place in the 15th century, when the philosophical treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum were rediscovered and translated into Latin for the first time. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus, as he was known to medieval European readers, was therefore a composite figure assembled from a variety of sources that had reached Europe by different routes and at different times. He was the ancient sage cited by the Church Fathers as a witness to the truths of natural theology. He was the master alchemist whose writings had been transmitted through Arabic translations and who was credited with the discovery of the philosopher's stone and the secrets of transmutation. He was the astrologer whose knowledge of the movements of the heavens was said to surpass that of all other practitioners of the celestial art. And he was, more vaguely, but no less importantly, a symbol of the ancient wisdom that the world had once possessed and had subsequently lost, a figure who represented the possibility that there existed, somewhere in the distant past, a complete and perfect knowledge of the divine, the natural, and the human that modern learning could only hope to recover and reconstruct. The personal strain that the conflict between the Hermetic tradition and the forces of religious orthodoxy imposed upon individual practitioners is difficult to assess, since the practitioners themselves left few records of their experiences. What can be said is that the pursuit of Hermetic learning in a Christian world was always an activity that carried certain risks. The association of Hermes Trismegistus with alchemy, astrology, and other forms of knowledge that the Church regarded with suspicion meant that those who devoted themselves to the study of the Hermetic writings could find themselves accused of heresy, superstition, or trafficking with evil spirits. These accusations were not always idle, and individuals who were known to be deeply involved in alchemical or astrological practice could face serious consequences, including imprisonment, the confiscation of their books and equipment, and, in extreme cases, execution. The history of the Hermetic tradition in the medieval and early modern periods is punctuated by episodes in which individual practitioners were subjected to investigation, censure, or punishment by the religious or secular authorities. And these episodes served as a reminder that the pursuit of Hermetic wisdom, however noble and ancient its pedigree, was an activity that took place at the margins of the accepted intellectual and religious order. The tension between the Hermetic tradition and the forces of religious orthodoxy was not unique to the Christian world. In the Islamic world, too, the pursuit of alchemical and astrological knowledge was sometimes viewed with suspicion by religious authorities, who questioned whether such knowledge was compatible with the teachings of the Quran and the prophetic tradition. Some Muslim scholars defended the study of alchemy and astrology as legitimate branches of natural philosophy, while others condemned them as forms of forbidden knowledge that led their practitioners into error and sin. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus, despite his identification with the prophet Idris, was not immune from this controversy, and the Hermetic tradition in the Islamic world, like its counterpart in the Christian world, existed in a state of perpetual tension with the forces of religious orthodoxy. Tolerated and even celebrated by some, condemned and marginalized by others, and always dependent for its survival on the willingness of individual scholars and communities to preserve and transmit a body of knowledge that the dominant religious institutions regarded with ambivalence at best. That moment arrived in the middle of the 15th century in the city of Florence, in the Italian peninsula, where a convergence of political, cultural, and intellectual circumstances created the conditions for one of the most remarkable episodes in the long history of the Hermetic tradition. The city of Florence, under the rule of the Medici family, had become one of the leading centers of the humanist movement, a broad cultural and intellectual phenomenon that sought to recover, study, and imitate the literary, philosophical, and artistic achievements of classical antiquity. Humanist scholars in Florence and other Italian cities devoted themselves to the collection and study of ancient manuscripts, and they traveled widely, to Constantinople, to the monasteries of Greece and the eastern Mediterranean, and to the libraries of the Islamic world in search of texts that had been lost to the Latin-speaking West since the fall of the Roman Empire. The patronage of the Medici family, and particularly of Cosimo de' Medici, the effective ruler of Florence for much of the mid-15th century, provided the financial resources and the institutional support that made this work of intellectual recovery possible on a grand scale. It was in this context that a manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum arrived in Florence, probably in the year 1460, brought from Macedonia by one of the agents whom Cosimo de' Medici had dispatched to search for ancient texts. The manuscript contained the first 14 treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum in Greek, and its arrival in Florence caused considerable excitement among the humanist scholars of the city. Cosimo de' Medici, who was at this time an old man in declining health, recognized the extraordinary importance of the manuscript and commissioned his most gifted protégé, the scholar and philosopher Marsilio Ficino, to translate it into Latin without delay. According to a famous anecdote, Cosimo instructed Ficino to set aside the translation of Plato's dialogues, which Ficino had been working on for some time, in order to complete the translation of the Hermetic texts first. Whether this anecdote is strictly accurate or not, it reflects the extraordinary esteem in which the figure of Hermes Trismegistus was held by Cosimo and his circle. For them, the Hermetic writings were not merely another body of ancient, philosophical texts to be studied and appreciated. They were the record of a primordial revelation, a body of wisdom that predated and surpassed all subsequent philosophy, including the philosophy of Plato himself, and their recovery represented an event of the very highest intellectual and spiritual significance. The impact of Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum on the intellectual life of Renaissance Europe was profound and far-reaching. The Hermetic texts were read, discussed, and commented upon by scholars and philosophers in every corner of the European world, and the ideas contained in those texts, the unity of God, the divine origin of the human soul, the correspondence between the macrocosm and the microcosm, the possibility of ascending from the material to the spiritual through knowledge and contemplation, became part of the common intellectual currency of the Renaissance. The influence of the Hermetic tradition can be traced in the philosophical writings of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who incorporated Hermetic ideas into his own ambitious synthesis of classical philosophy, Jewish Kabbalah, and Christian theology. It can be traced in the natural philosophy of Giordano Bruno, who drew upon the Hermetic vision of an animated and ensouled cosmos in developing his own revolutionary conception of an infinite universe containing innumerable worlds. It can be traced in the work of the physician and alchemist Paracelsus, who invoked the authority of Hermes Trismegistus in his efforts to reform the practice of medicine and to establish a new understanding of the relationship between the human body and the natural world. And it can be traced more diffusely, but no less importantly, in the general intellectual atmosphere of the Renaissance, which was characterized by a confidence in the power of the human mind to penetrate the secrets of nature and to ascend, through the exercise of reason and imagination, to a direct apprehension of the divine. The years that followed the publication of Ficino's translation saw the name of Hermes Trismegistus invoked with increasing frequency and in an ever-widening range of intellectual contexts. Hermetic ideas were discussed in university lecture halls, in the studies of humanist scholars, in the workshops of alchemists and physicians, and in the courts of princes and popes. The Cathedral of Siena contained a famous mosaic floor laid down in the 1480s that depicted Hermes Trismegistus, alongside Moses and the Sibyls, as one of the great prophets and revealers of divine truth, and this image of the ancient Egyptian sage standing in a place of honor on the floor of a Christian cathedral captured something essential about the status that Hermes Trismegistus had attained in the intellectual and religious culture of the Renaissance. He was not merely an interesting historical figure or a source of curious philosophical ideas. He was, in the eyes of many Renaissance thinkers, one of the most important figures in the entire history of human wisdom, a figure whose teachings illuminated the deepest mysteries of the cosmos and whose authority was exceeded only by that of the divine revelation itself. The astrological tradition, too, drew extensively on the Hermetic corpus during the Renaissance. Astrologers cited the authority of Hermes Trismegistus in support of their claims about the influence of the celestial bodies upon human affairs, and Hermetic concepts, particularly the idea of a correspondence between the macrocosm of the heavens and the microcosm of the human being, provided a philosophical framework within which the practices of horoscopic astrology could be justified and explained. The Renaissance was a period of intense interest in astrology at all levels of society, from the courts of kings and popes to the workshops and marketplaces of ordinary cities and towns, and the name of Hermes Trismegistus was routinely invoked by practitioners who sought to lend their art the prestige and authority of the most ancient and venerable tradition of celestial knowledge. Court astrologers prepared horoscopes for the births of princes and for the timing of military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations, and in doing so they drew upon a body of astrological doctrine that could be traced through a long and winding chain of transmission to the technical Hermetica of the early centuries of the Common Era and beyond. The influence of the Hermetic tradition upon the visual arts of the Renaissance, while less frequently discussed than its influence upon philosophy and the sciences, was nonetheless significant. The image of Hermes Trismegistus appeared in paintings, mosaics, engravings, and illustrated manuscripts throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, and the iconography associated with him, the figure of the ancient sage, often depicted as a bearded man in priestly robes, holding a book or a tablet, sometimes accompanied by symbols of the celestial spheres or by the winged staff of the caduceus, became a recognizable and widely disseminated element of Renaissance visual culture. The symbolic vocabulary of the Hermetic tradition, the Ouroboros, or serpent eating its own tail, representing the eternal cycle of creation and dissolution. The sun and moon representing the masculine and feminine principles of the cosmos, the three-tiered structure of the divine, the celestial, and the terrestrial worlds, provided a rich repertoire of images and motifs that Renaissance artists employed in allegorical and emblematic compositions. The Hermetic emphasis on the correspondences between different levels of reality, and on the idea that the visible world was a reflection of invisible truths, resonated deeply with the artistic sensibility of the Renaissance, which was characterized by a conviction that the work of art could serve as a vehicle for the expression of profound philosophical and spiritual ideas. The natural, magic tradition, which sought to harness the hidden powers and correspondences of the natural world for practical purposes, also drew heavily upon the Hermetic writings. The concept of sympathia, The idea that all things in the cosmos are connected by invisible bonds of sympathy and antipathy, and that these connections can be understood and manipulated by the knowledgeable practitioner, was a central Hermetic idea, and it provided the theoretical foundation for a wide range of magical practices, from the making of talismans and amulets to the use of herbs, stones, and other natural substances for medicinal and protective purposes. The boundary between natural magic, alchemy, astrology, and natural philosophy was often blurry in the Renaissance, and the figure of Hermes Trismegistus stood at the center of this interconnected web of disciplines, lending his authority to all of them and providing a common conceptual framework within which they could be understood as different aspects of a single, comprehensive science of the natural world. Yet even during the period of its greatest prominence and influence, the Hermetic tradition was not without its critics and opponents. Some Christian theologians questioned the propriety of according such high status to a pagan sage, particularly one whose writings contained passages that seemed to endorse magical practices and the invocation of demonic powers. Others raised more specific objections to particular Hermetic doctrines that appeared to conflict with Christian orthodoxy. The idea, for example, that the human soul was inherently divine and could achieve salvation through knowledge alone, without the mediation of Christ and the sacraments of the Church. And a few scholars, working within the tradition of humanist philological criticism, began to raise questions about the dating and authenticity of the Hermetic texts that would eventually undermine the entire edifice of the Prisca Theologia and dramatically alter the status of Hermes Trismegistus in the intellectual culture of Europe. The decisive blow to the traditional dating of the Hermetic writings was delivered by the French Protestant scholar Isaac Casaubon, who published his findings in a work entitled De Rebus Sacris et Ecclesiasticis Exercitationes in 1614. Casaubon, a formidable philologist with an intimate knowledge of Greek and Latin literature, subjected the Hermetic texts to a careful linguistic and historical analysis and concluded that they could not possibly have been written in the remote antiquity claimed for them. The Greek of the Corpus Hermeticum, Casaubon argued, was not the Greek of the earliest periods of Greek literature, but rather the Greek of the post-classical period. The kind of Greek that was written in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. The philosophical vocabulary and concepts employed in the Hermetic texts showed clear evidence of the influence of Platonic, Stoic, and other Greek philosophical traditions that had not existed in the time when Hermes Trismegistus was supposed to have lived. And the theological ideas expressed in the Hermetic writings bore such a close resemblance to Christian doctrine that it was far more plausible to suppose that the Hermetic writers had borrowed from Christianity than that the early Christians had borrowed from Hermes. Casaubon concluded that the Hermetic texts were not the work of an ancient Egyptian sage who had lived before Moses and Plato, but rather the products of the early centuries of the Common Era, composed by unknown writers who had drawn upon the philosophical and religious resources of their own time, and attributed their work to the legendary figure of Hermes Trismegistus, in order to lend it an authority that it would not otherwise have possessed. The impact of Casaubon's dating of the Hermetic texts was not immediate or uniform. Some scholars accepted his conclusions readily and adjusted their understanding of the Hermetic tradition accordingly. Others resisted the new dating, either because they were unwilling to abandon the idea of a Prisca Theologia or because they found Casaubon's philological arguments unconvincing. The alchemical and esoteric traditions, which had drawn so heavily on the authority of Hermes Trismegistus, were slower to absorb the implications of Casaubon's work, and the name of Hermes continued to be invoked in alchemical and occult circles long after the scholarly consensus had turned against the traditional dating. Over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, however, the new dating gradually became the accepted view among mainstream scholars, and the figure of Hermes Trismegistus was progressively relegated from the position of supreme sage and prophet to the more modest status of a literary character in a collection of late ancient philosophical texts. The process by which the Hermetic tradition lost its privileged position in European intellectual culture was a slow and gradual one, unfolding over the course of several generations. It was not the result of a single decisive event. Casaubon's dating, important as it was only one factor among many, but rather the cumulative effect of a series of intellectual and cultural changes that, taken together, transformed the way in which European thinkers understood the relationship between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge. The rise of the new natural philosophy, associated with figures such as Galileo, Descartes, and Newton, offered a way of understanding the natural world that was based on mathematical reasoning and empirical observation rather than on the authority of ancient texts, and it gradually displaced the Hermetic and alchemical traditions from the center of scientific inquiry. The development of historical and philological criticism, of which Casaubon's work on the Hermetic texts was a notable example, made it increasingly difficult to maintain the traditional claims about the antiquity and authority of ancient writings, and it encouraged a more critical and skeptical attitude toward the entire body of ancient learning. And the increasing rationalization and secularization of European culture, which gathered momentum during the 17th and 18th centuries, created an intellectual environment in which the mystical and devotional elements of the Hermetic tradition seemed increasingly out of place. The 20th century revival of scholarly interest in the Hermetic tradition was associated in particular with the work of several scholars whose research transformed the understanding of the Hermetic texts and their place in the history of Western thought. The French scholar André-Jean Festugière published a comprehensive study of the Hermetic writings in the 1940s and 1950s, providing new critical editions of the Greek texts, along with detailed historical and philosophical commentary. The English scholar Frances Yates, in her influential book Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, published in 1964, argued that the Hermetic tradition had played a far more important role in the intellectual history of the Renaissance than had previously been recognized, and that the Hermetic vision of an animated and magically operative cosmos had been a significant factor in the development of the new science of the 17th century. Yates's thesis was controversial and has been challenged on a number of points, but it succeeded in bringing the Hermetic tradition to the attention of a wide audience of historians and intellectuals and in establishing the study of Hermeticism as a legitimate and important field of historical inquiry. Subsequent scholars have built upon and refined the work of Festugière, Yates, and others, and the Hermetic tradition is now recognized as one of the most significant and influential intellectual movements of the ancient and early modern worlds. The texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus were read in the lecture halls of late antique Alexandria, in the scriptoria of Byzantine monasteries, in the libraries of Arab scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba, in the studies of Renaissance humanists in Florence and Rome, in the laboratories of early modern alchemists, in the lodges of Freemasons and Rosicrucians, and in the seminar rooms of modern universities. At each stage of this long journey, the texts were interpreted anew, adapted to new circumstances, and made to speak to new questions and concerns. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus, who had never existed as a historical individual, proved to be more enduring and more influential than many figures who had. He was a creation of the human imagination, a composite figure assembled from the materials of two ancient civilizations, and yet he came to represent something that was felt to be real and important. The possibility that there existed a form of knowledge so deep, so comprehensive, and so fundamental that it could illuminate every aspect of the natural and the divine, and that this knowledge was available, in principle, to any human being who was willing to undertake the discipline and the devotion necessary to receive it. In the centuries that followed the work of Casaubon, the scholarly understanding of the Hermetic tradition continued to evolve. The discovery of new Hermetic texts among the Nag Hammadi codices, a collection of Gnostic and related writings found in Upper Egypt in 1945, added significantly to the available corpus of Hermetic literature and provided new evidence about the relationship between the Hermetic tradition and the various Gnostic movements of late antiquity. The Nag Hammadi collection included several Hermetic texts that had not previously been known, including a Coptic version of a portion of the Asclepius and a text known as the Discourse on the Eighth and Ninth, which describes a mystical ascent through the celestial spheres under the guidance of Hermes Trismegistus. These discoveries confirmed that the Hermetic tradition had been more diverse and more widely distributed than the surviving Greek and Latin texts alone had suggested, and they opened new avenues of research into the social, cultural, and religious contexts in which the Hermetic writings had been produced and received. The Discourse on the Eighth and Ninth, in particular, provided scholars with a remarkably vivid account of a Hermetic initiation ceremony, in which the student, guided by the voice of the master, progresses through successive levels of spiritual experience until he reaches a state of mystical union with the divine mind. The text describes the student experiencing a vision of light, hearing the singing of the celestial powers, and feeling a profound joy and peace that transcends anything that ordinary language can express. The master instructs the student to write down the account of his experience in hieroglyphic characters and to place it in the temple as a record for future generations. This text, preserved in the dry sands of Upper Egypt for more than 15 centuries, offered a window into the experiential dimension of the Hermetic tradition that the more philosophical treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum had only hinted at, and it demonstrated that the Hermetic path was not merely a system of ideas, but a lived practice of contemplation, prayer, and spiritual ascent that engaged the whole of the practitioner's being. The study of the Hermetic tradition in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has been characterized by an increasing recognition of the complexity and diversity of the Hermetic corpus, and by an effort to situate the Hermetic writings within the broader intellectual and religious history of the ancient Mediterranean world. Scholars have moved away from the earlier tendency to treat the Hermetic tradition as a monolithic system of thought and have instead emphasized the variety of perspectives, concerns, and literary forms that are represented within the Hermetic corpus. The relationship between the philosophical Hermetica and the technical Hermetica, between the Greek Hermetic texts and the Hermetic writings that survive in Coptic, Latin, Arabic, and other languages, and between the Hermetic tradition and the various other philosophical, religious, and scientific traditions with which it interacted, have all been subjects of intensive scholarly investigation and debate. The result has been a richer, more nuanced, and more historically grounded understanding of the Hermetic tradition than has ever been available before, and a growing appreciation of the significance of the Hermetic writings as documents of one of the most creative and productive periods in the history of human thought. The long view of the Hermetic tradition reveals a pattern that is, in some respects, unique in the history of Western intellectual life. No other body of ancient writings has had quite the same combination of characteristics. The attribution to a single revered figure, the blending of philosophical speculation with practical instruction, the capacity to be read and reinterpreted in radically different cultural and historical contexts, and the remarkable resilience that allowed the tradition to survive the repeated destruction of the institutional frameworks within which it was transmitted. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus, who was never a real person, proved to be more durable than many of the real people who shaped the intellectual history of the West, and the texts attributed to him continued to find readers and admirers long after the historical circumstances that produced them had ceased to exist. It is this vision of a cosmos that is both intelligible and sacred, both rational and mysterious, that has given the Hermetic tradition its enduring appeal and that has ensured the survival of the texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus across so many centuries of cultural and intellectual change. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus stands at the center of this vision, not as a historical person, but as a symbol of the human aspiration toward a knowledge that is not merely informational but transformative, not merely analytical but integrative, not merely intellectual but spiritual. The texts that bear his name were composed by men and women whose names have been forgotten, working in the cities of the ancient Mediterranean at a time when the old religious and philosophical certainties were giving way, and new forms of understanding were struggling to be born. They wrote in Greek, the language of philosophy, but they wrote about things that philosophy alone could not fully express. And they attributed their writings to a figure who was himself a creation of the meeting between two civilizations, two languages, and two ways of seeing the world. In doing so, they created a body of literature that has outlasted the civilizations that produced it, and that continues in its quiet and unassuming way to offer its readers a glimpse of something that lies beyond the reach of ordinary knowledge, something ancient, something luminous, and something that has never quite been captured in any other form of words.